Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Last night, at a party meant to celebrate my brother's promotion, my dad stood up, raised his glass, and announced loudly, finally, someone who makes this family proud. The room erupted in clapping, cheering, even whistling, and for a moment I felt like a guest at my own execution. It wasn't the first time he had compared us, but it was the first time he did it publicly in front of every relative, colleague, and neighbor he could gather. I sat there frozen, smiling the kind of smile you make when you want to disappear, while my brother soaked in the spotlight like it was his birthright. And then, out of nowhere, my husband calmly placed a folder on the table, pulled out printed receipts, and said in the clearest voice I have ever heard him use, "Odd, since all these bills were paid by her." The sound in the room changed instantly. The clapping stopped, people shifted in their chairs, and even my brother's fiancée glanced at him with a sharp look I had never seen her give. My brother, always quick with a joke, tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a couple of favors. My dad waved dismissively and muttered something like, "Family helps family," as though that settled everything. But Evan kept going. He didn't shout, he didn't sneer, he simply laid out statement after statement, each one showing how I had been covering the rent when my brother fell behind, paying for the car insurance he let lapse, and even wiring money when his phone bill went into collections. I could feel my face burning, not from shame but from a strange mix of anger and relief, because for once it wasn't me spelling it out, it was someone else showing the truth. I took a breath and said, as evenly as I could, "For years I helped because Mom asked, because Dad said it would all even out, because Matt promised it was temporary." But nothing ever evened out, and temporary became permanent. My brother's smile slipped, but he still tried to dismiss it as an exaggeration. My father cut in with his usual line about how success is about who climbs the ladder fastest, and that I should be proud my brother finally made it. And I swear, in that moment, something in me shifted. I realized they would never acknowledge me unless I forced them to, and I was done waiting for scraps of recognition. I pulled out my phone right there and opened the accounts where my name was still listed as a backup. The family phone plan, the spare card on the rideshare account, the auto-pay for utilities tied to his apartment. One by one I removed my information. I didn't make a show of it, I just did it silently, until Evan nudged me and whispered, "Send him the notice now." So I typed a short message to my brother and copied his fiancée, "Support is over, effective immediately. Ledger attached. Repayment plan will follow." I hit send. My brother looked at his phone, his jaw tightening. My father leaned toward me and hissed, "You're making a scene." And that was the exact second I stopped caring about their version of events. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, I'm correcting one." The room felt heavier, but for the first time in years, I felt light. I thought that would be the end of it for the night, but the real fallout came later. The official party wrapped up and most people went home, but Matt invited a smaller group to continue at a bar nearby, saying he wanted to cover the tab as a gesture of gratitude. I didn't go. I went home, made tea, and sat in silence with Evan. Around midnight my phone buzzed. It was my brother calling from the sidewalk outside the bar, furious and panicked, because his card had declined on the group tab. He whispered urgently, "Fix it. Put it on your card like you always do. People are waiting." And I said, with no hesitation this time, "No." Then I hung up. That was the moment the whole game changed. For years, I had been the invisible safety net, the one they could count on to quietly cover the holes, while they pretended I didn't exist. But the second I cut the cord, the illusion cracked. The proud speech, the applause, the performance of success, all of it depended on me playing along. And now I wasn't playing. What came next was a chain reaction I never could have predicted. Within 24 hours, my brother's fiancée started asking questions I knew he couldn't answer. Within a week, my parents were calling me to smooth things over, insisting I had embarrassed the family. But the truth was out, and I had no intention of burying it again. Can you guess what happened next? By the time the sun came up, I understood that the speech and the folder of receipts were not an ending or even a fight one in a crowded room, but only the starting point of a slow, clean break that would need discipline, patience, and a willingness to be called cruel by people who were perfectly comfortable calling me useful. So I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began tracing every line that tied my money to my brother's life, because if the previous night had taught me anything, it was that the story only changes when the facts sit in places where feelings can no longer smother them. I moved through the accounts one by one, not with rage or drama, but with the steady focus you use when you finally decide to fix a leaky roof instead of putting out pots every time it rains, and the pattern showed itself almost immediately. The family phone plan with an extra line that never left his pocket, the streaming bundle billed to my name, but registered to his address, the rideshare account that treated my card like an oxygen tank whenever his balance hit zero, and the quiet utility autopays that had turned my generosity into a permanent subsidy, so I turned them off, confirmed each change by email, saved the confirmations, and felt a kind of calm settle in that I hadn't felt in years. Then I called Lydia, the accountant who has handled our family's taxes and paperwork since we were old enough to file anything, and I told her I needed a clean ledger that showed every transfer, payment, and reimbursement promise attached to my name for my brother's benefit, and I needed copies of anything that carried my signature or my guarantee. Because if there was a single lesson I kept relearning the hard way, it was that memory is negotiable in this family, while documents are not. Lydia did not ask why I had not requested this sooner. She simply said she would compile what she had, and an hour later a secure link landed in my inbox with scanned statements, wire confirmations, a payment plan draft I had apparently approved by text 2 years ago during a chaotic holiday week, and a short-term guarantor page for my brother's apartment with my signature sitting right beside a quick note in my father's handwriting that said "Thank you, kiddo," which hit me harder than I expected because it proved exactly what everyone later denied, that they knew what they were asking and they knew who they were asking it from. I put it all into a single folder, labeled it in plain language, and wrote to my brother with a tone I used to save for work when a vendor was past due. Here is the total, here are the dates, here's a schedule with small steady payments that do not strangle you. And here is the interest set at the lowest legal rate, because I am not trying to profit off a mess, I am trying to end one. I copied his fiancée, not to humiliate him, but because I had learned the hard way that private promises evaporate in private, and because she deserves to understand the house she might be walking into with eyes fully open. Almost immediately my phone lit up with a call from him that started with wounded jokes and slid fast into accusations. The usual mix of "you know I will make it right" and "why are you making it look worse than it was," and "when I did not bend." His voice hardened and he said I was embarrassing him for sport, which would have stung once, but now it just confirmed that we were finally speaking honest words about what had been happening for years under nicer names. My father called right after, full of that old authority that makes you 12 again unless you recognize it for what it is, telling me I had crossed a line by bringing finances into the open and that families do not issue invoices. To which I answered that families also do not use one daughter as a silent bank while pretending she is a footnote, and perhaps if we had treated obligations like paperwork earlier, we would not be standing in this swamp now. When he tried to pull me back into the old loop where I explain myself until he decides to be generous, I let the silence sit, and when he ran out of steam I simply said that the plan was fair, it was documented, and it was the only plan I would accept. Because I wanted everything to live where it could be verified, I asked Lydia to send me revised year-to-date statements on letterhead that reflected the amounts I had covered as loans rather than gifts, and I requested a simple attestation that, as of this week, I had removed myself as guarantor and as backup payer from every account that was not mine, and she provided both without commentary, which I appreciated more than I can say. Here is where people will accuse me of playing dirty, but I knew the next step before anyone else did. My brother had once listed me as a dependent contact on a voluntary benefits update at his company. A harmless little checkbox back when he wanted to show an employer that he was part of a supportive family, and I asked Lydia to forward the updated letter to the compliance address on that benefits portal because, if his file mentioned me at all, it needed to mention the truth, namely that I was not a dependent, I was the creditor whose support had ended, and whose repayment schedule had begun. By evening, the air around the family felt different, not loud or explosive, but heavy with the knowledge that the old tricks were not going to work this time, and that is when the unintended consequence landed. Not because I called anyone at his job or tried to sabotage him, but because large companies have rules that do not care about sibling politics. And when a file says there is an unresolved financial obligation between two adults who are connected on official documents, it triggers a routine check. He called me from the parking lot sounding smaller than I have ever heard him, saying that Human Resources had paused his promotion paperwork pending clarification, and could I please send a note smoothing it over? Because it was just family business, and they were making it a big deal, and for a long moment I stared at the wall and thought about every single late-night rescue I had performed so he would not feel uncomfortable. I told him I would send exactly what was true and nothing I would later regret, and I wrote a short note that confirmed the existence of personal loans, confirmed the removal of my guarantees as of now, and confirmed that a repayment plan had been offered and was waiting for his signature, and I sent it with my full name and nothing else. No apologies, no softening, no extra lines he could twist into permission. A few minutes later, another message popped up. A single sentence that was so familiar it could have been a family motto: fix this. I looked at the word fix and understood that, for years, it had meant pay, cover, lie, forget, and move on, and that now it would have to mean something else entirely, because I had taken my hands off the machine and the machine was still running. And if it rattled, that was not a sign for me to climb back inside. It was a sign that the people who built it needed to repair it themselves. When I woke the following morning, the first thing I noticed was the absence of panic in my chest, because for the first time in years I had not left the door open for someone else to walk in and dump their crisis at my feet. And although my phone was already filling with messages from my brother, my father, and even my mother, I felt strangely steady, as if the silence of the night before had hardened into a shield. My brother's texts ranged from pitiful pleas about how I was ruining his momentum, to aggressive threats about how I was destroying the family name. And in between, he kept insisting that all of this was temporary and unnecessary, because he had every intention of paying me back eventually. The word eventually has been the most expensive word in my life, because it allowed everyone around me to keep deferring their responsibilities while I kept paying the real bills, and I finally understood that if I allowed it to continue, I would be signing up for another decade of the same dynamic. I met Paula for coffee that afternoon, a woman who has been my mentor at work for years, someone who has seen me solve impossible projects while at the same time accepting emotional scraps from my family. And I told her everything from the speech to the receipts to the fallout. She listened without interruption, then leaned forward and said in the most practical tone, "Deadlines, not feelings." At first the sentence sounded harsh, almost cold, but the more I sat with it, the more it felt like the only lifeline that could keep me from sliding back into old patterns. If every discussion with my family was left to emotions, guilt, and manipulation, I would never win. But if I shifted the frame to dates, signatures, and consequences, then I finally stood a chance at changing the game. That night, I sat at my desk with the folder of documents Lydia had given me and drafted a formal demand letter, not in the voice of a desperate sister, but in the voice of a creditor who had already given too much time. I laid out the total sum, attached the supporting evidence, and stated that he had 10 business days to accept and sign the repayment plan. To make it concrete, I also pointed to the vehicle he drove, the one I had saved from repossession last year by wiring several months of overdue payments directly to the lender, and I explained that if he failed to act within the timeline, I would file a UCC lien against that asset, which meant his car could not be sold, refinanced, or leveraged without acknowledging me as a secured creditor. I attached the receipt from that rescue payment and the title history with my name in the transaction, because I knew that if he could deny anything else, he could not deny the paper in front of him. Sending that email did not feel like vengeance. It felt like drawing a line across the sand and finally standing behind it, and yet the response from my family was as though I had committed treason. My father called, not to ask questions, but to lecture me about loyalty and family values, repeating over and over that families do not sue families. which struck me as ironic since no one had objected when my money had been used as though I were an unending institution instead of a daughter. I told him calmly that I was not suing anyone. I was simply creating boundaries that had legal teeth, and I ended the call before the conversation circled back to the same manipulative loop I had lived in for years. The next step I took was something no one in the family expected. I opened a small scholarship fund at the community college our grandmother once attended, naming it after her. Because she had been the only person in my childhood who believed in me without terms or conditions. I seeded the fund with a modest sum, using part of a work bonus I had been saving, and I set it up so that every repayment I received from my brother would funnel directly into that scholarship, turning what had once been hidden, embarrassing transfers into something visible and positive. Then, without any flourish, I dropped the link into the family group chat with a simple message: money goes where it is respected. The silence that followed was deafening. My brother responded first, accusing me of trying to humiliate him publicly and ruin his relationship with his fiancée. My father followed with a paragraph about how I was making everything harder than it needed to be. My mother sent a shorter message that simply read, "Please stop this before it goes too far." But Sophia, my brother's fiancée, said nothing in the group chat, and that silence carried a weight of its own, because I knew she was calculating and observant. And sooner or later, she would begin adding up the numbers that my brother had never been able to balance. 2 nights later, Sophia called me privately. She sounded calm but firm, and she admitted that she had been going through old messages on my brother's phone and had stumbled across texts from my father telling him to stall her until the ceremony, meaning me, as though my needs were an obstacle to be delayed rather than obligations to be respected. She said she was tired of being told half-truths, and she wanted the whole story before she made any major decisions about her future with him. Then she asked me for one specific thing: proof that I had signed the apartment guarantor form under pressure, because my brother had told her it was voluntary and insignificant. I opened the folder Lydia had given me and found exactly what she needed: my rushed signature next to my father's scrawled note thanking me. I told her I would send the copy, not because I wanted to destroy her relationship, but because if she was about to marry into this family, she deserved to see what temporary really meant in practice. She thanked me, and her voice cracked slightly before she hung up, and I realized that for the first time, the weight of my father's favoritism and my brother's irresponsibility was not only my burden. Someone else could see it clearly. That night, as I prepared the documents to send her, I realized that every step I had taken since the toast at the party had been less about punishing my brother and more about refusing to erase myself, and that while the road ahead was bound to be ugly, the foundation was shifting in my favor. My brother had lost his comfortable secrecy, my father had lost his ability to control the narrative, and I had gained allies in places they never expected. For the first time, I was not the one living in fear of what would happen if the truth came out. Now they were. The morning after my call with Sophia, I woke up with a different kind of energy, the kind that comes when you realize people are finally seeing the cracks you have been quietly living inside for years, and while I knew the fallout would be messy, I also knew that I could not allow myself to retreat now that the truth had begun to spread beyond my own head. For too long I had let my family dictate the terms of reality, bending myself into silence while they told stories that erased my role. But once the evidence moved into the hands of people outside that circle, the control shifted, and there was no way to push everything back into the shadows without creating even more questions. I spent the morning going through every document one more time, not because I doubted what I had already uncovered, but because I wanted to be sure that whatever I handed over could stand on its own with no need for explanations that my family could twist. I prepared a folder for Sophia that contained the lease page with my signature and my father's little note, the payment confirmations for the vehicle I had rescued, and screenshots of the texts where both of my parents had pressured me to be a team player, while telling me it would all be temporary. I did not add commentary. I did not try to sway her with speeches. I simply organized the facts so she could see what temporary looked like in practice. When I finally hit send, I felt both exposed and strangely lighter, because I was no longer the only person carrying the ledger of what had been done. At the same time, I took another step that I knew would send ripples into my brother's professional life, though again, not because I wanted revenge, but because accuracy matters when companies evaluate their employees. I authorized Lydia to share a notarized letter with my brother's HR department that confirmed three things: that personal loans existed between us, that I had removed myself as guarantor on every account as of now, and that a repayment plan had been presented. There were no accusations, no insults, no dramatics, only dates, numbers, and signatures. It was the clean truth, and I knew that once it landed in the right inbox, it would erase the old illusion that he had built his success without strings attached. By evening, the blowback began. My father appeared at my door without calling, a move that once would have sent me into a panic, but now only triggered a calm refusal to be intimidated in my own home. He started with the same lines I had heard since childhood, about loyalty, about family honor, about how I was poisoning relationships that would matter long after money came and went. But this time I did not shrink, because every sentence he spoke felt weaker when said against the pile of documents on my desk that told the real story. I told him directly that I was not ruining anything. I was saving myself from a lifetime of being erased, and if that embarrassed him, then perhaps he should examine the system he built that depended on my silence. He had no answer to that, and when he realized I was not going to crumble, he left without slamming the door, which almost shocked me more than anything he said. Later that night, I filed the UCC lien. It was not glamorous or dramatic, just a form submitted and confirmed, a line of text in a public database that tied my name to his car until the debt was resolved. But to me it represented something much larger, a permanent record that could not be gaslit away, a simple fact that would follow him until he made things right. When I closed my laptop, I felt the odd satisfaction of knowing that I had created something undeniable, and I did not need to yell, argue, or beg. The ripple effects came faster than I anticipated. Within a week, my brother's company delayed the formal board vote on his promotion package, citing unresolved financial obligations, which was exactly what I had expected the moment Lydia sent the notarized letter. At nearly the same time, Sophia postponed their engagement dinner, sending out polite messages about scheduling conflicts, but I knew from her tone that she was not ready to commit while half-truths hovered over every conversation. The weight of those delays fell squarely on my brother, not on me, and for once I did not feel the slightest pull to shield him from the consequences. Then came the text from my mother. It was only 3 words, "We need to talk," followed by "just us," and that simple phrase carried the whole history of how she had always tried to handle family messes by pulling me aside, softening the edges, and asking me to undo myself quietly for the sake of peace. I stared at those words longer than I want to admit, because part of me still wanted to believe she could finally see the truth, but another part knew exactly what was coming: another round of guilt, another plea to protect the family name, another request for me to sacrifice in silence. As I sat there looking at her message, I realized that every step I had taken since the party had forced the truth into places where it could not be ignored. My brother could no longer spin stories without evidence contradicting him, my father could no longer silence me with authority, and my mother could no longer play mediator without admitting that she had asked me to carry more than my share. The scholarship fund was already seated, the lien was already filed, and Sophia already had the documents in her hands. The narrative had shifted, and the people who once controlled it were suddenly scrambling to manage fallout they had never expected. The old me would have agreed to meet my mother immediately, to sit in her kitchen while she explained why I needed to step back and let my brother shine, but the new me understood something crucial. Once you start putting the truth on paper, you cannot go back to whispers. If my family wanted to deal with me now, they would have to meet me on solid ground, with signatures and agreements, not guilt and appeals to loyalty. As I closed my phone that night, I understood that I had crossed into territory that could never be undone. The truth was out, the structures were in place, and the next conversation with my mother would not be about smoothing things over, but about whether she could accept me as more than a silent safety net. And as much as it hurt to imagine losing even the small scraps of affection I used to get, I knew that nothing compared to the relief of finally standing on my own terms. The question was not whether she would try to pull me back into silence, but whether I would let her, and for the first time in my life, I already knew the answer. When my mother finally asked to meet just us, I agreed on the condition that we do it somewhere neutral where neither of us could retreat into old habits. So we chose a quiet coffee place near the library where I used to study after work. And I arrived with the same calm I had been practicing for weeks, because I knew that if I let even a small piece of the old script back in, I would walk out having promised something that would bleed me dry for another year. She started with a familiar tremor in her voice and said she never meant to put so much on me, that she only asked because I was capable and reliable and because it seemed easier at the time, and I listened without interruption. Not because the words softened anything, but because I could finally hear the truth inside them, which was that capability had become a convenient excuse to keep me on the hook while the temporary favors multiplied into a lifestyle that served everyone but me. I told her that I loved her and that I understood how a family can slide into a pattern that feels normal while it quietly chews through one person's life, and I told her that loving them was the exact reason I had to stop participating, because love without boundaries turns into a credit line for other people's comfort, and I was done being their line of credit. She asked if there was any way to fix this without legal stuff hanging over my brother, and I said there was, and that it was simple, and that it required everyone to act like adults who respect consequences. Because the lien and the HR letters were not revenge but structure, and structure is how grown people keep their promises when feelings get messy. I laid out 3 steps that were clear and boring and utterly non-negotiable. My brother would sign the repayment agreement and put the dates on his calendar like a bill he intends to pay. He and my father would sign a short apology acknowledging the apartment guarantor stunt and the years of stall her until the ceremony tactics, and they would confirm, in writing, that my name had been removed from every account, every emergency contact, and every benefits portal where it could imply support. That did not exist. I promised that if those steps were completed and the first 2 payments cleared, I would notify HR that the matter had been resolved and I would schedule the withdrawal of the lien as soon as the balance reached 0, and I repeated that last part twice, because I wanted no room for creative interpretation later. She cried in a quieter way than I expected and said she wished it had not come to this, and I told her I did too, but that I was not going to apologize for protecting myself, because the person I used to be would have apologized just to end the discomfort, and then we would be right back where we started, and frankly I was too tired to be that person anymore. She asked if the scholarship in our grandmother's name was real or if I had used it as a tactic, and I told her it was as real as the students who would receive it, and that the first thank you note had already arrived. And she wiped her eyes and said our grandmother would have been proud, which was the first sentence in weeks that did not feel like a negotiation. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with an email from my brother that contained the signed agreement and a very short apology that managed to be both stiff and sincere, followed by a separate note from my father whose tone was formal in a way I had never seen, which told me he finally understood that this was not going to be bullied back into silence. The first payment landed the next morning, and I watched it route itself into the scholarship account exactly as designed, and for the first time since I had taken my card off his accounts, I exhaled without needing to check a balance or brace for a crisis. I forwarded a concise update to HR that stated the repayment plan had been executed, and that there would be no further financial entanglements or guarantees from me going forward. And the compliance manager replied with a neutral acknowledgement that felt like a small medal pinned to my chest for doing the painfully boring thing that keeps messy people honest. There was still one conversation left, and that was the rescheduled dinner, a smaller affair than the original celebration because the energy had shifted in ways that no one wanted to name out loud. And before I walked in, I promised myself that I would not turn it into a trial or a victory lap, because I did not need either. I needed closure that fit the person I had worked hard to become. When the glasses were raised and the usual toasts threatened to start their predictable loop, I stood and said something I had rehearsed exactly once in the mirror, not to perform but to finish. And I kept my voice even as I said that respect is not a feeling or a speech or a title, it is documented boundaries with teeth, and that from now on my presence at any family event would require those boundaries to be observed without negotiation. I did not list numbers or wave papers or deliver a grand expose, because the people who mattered had already seen the receipts, and the rest could read whatever. Story made them comfortable as long as it did not cost me another cent or another piece of my sanity. My brother nodded without arguing, which surprised me enough that I almost lost my train of thought, and his fiancée, who had been quiet through most of the evening, reached for his hand in a way that looked less like blind loyalty and more like a joint decision to grow up or walk away, and I decided it was none of my business which option they chose as long as I was no longer part of the collateral. My father raised his glass for a brief, subdued toast that mentioned hard lessons and second chances and the importance of paying what you owe, and for once I did not feel the sting of being left out, because the lesson had landed where it needed to land, and the only person I needed to hear from was the one who had finally figured out her worth. On the way home, Evan told me something he had kept quiet until the dust settled, which was that months ago, when he realized how deep the pattern ran, he had set up an automatic safeguard so that any unexpected, temporary reimbursements I might make in a moment of weakness would route straight into the scholarship fund instead of back into the family machine, and I laughed in that shaky way you laugh when a weight you carried so long you forgot it was there suddenly lifts, and I told him that he knows me too well, and that I am grateful he prepared for the version of me that might have stumbled, even though the version walking beside him now had learned to stay upright. By the end of the week, HR cleared my brother's promotion with a note that the file had been updated and the concern resolved. The second scholarship disbursement email arrived with a message from a student who said that someone believed in them at the exact right moment, and my mother sent a photo of our grandmother's old graduation program with a simple line that said, "She would have liked your rules." I did not gloat, I did not spike the ball, I did not rewrite the past into a story where I was always brave, because that would be another kind of lie, and I am done with lies, even the flattering ones. I won in the only way that mattered to me, which was quietly, permanently, and on paper, and while there will always be edges that do not smooth out, the core is solid, the message is clear. And the next time someone stands at a party and tries to define who makes this family proud, they will do it knowing that pride without fairness is just noise, and that the day I replaced silence with receipts was the day the noise finally stopped.